Alhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone, alhamdulillah, to this three-part series of reading the Quran with a Maqasid lens with our dear teacher, Dr. Auda. May Allah preserve him. It's good to be here with everyone, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, and thank you for this amazing journey of knowledge this past 3 weeks, alhamdulillah. We had covered in the first week the centrality of Maqasid in the Quranic logic and structure. Last week we covered the Maqasid-based thematic interpretation. And today we're going to be looking at a general Maqasid framework for Islamic scholarship. Dr. Jasser had said that inshallah he'll be speaking for a little bit, and then we have the opportunity to ask questions, a lot of the questions that maybe we've had throughout the weeks and we've not been able to ask, or things that come up. Alhamdulillah, we have this opportunity today as the final class, inshallah, to ask our questions. Without further ado, Dr. Jasser. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Barakallahu feekum, Sister Ajara. Perhaps I should find my file and share it with you. It is, I'm just trying to. Play. Oh, here it is. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه بارك عليك كما يحب ربنا ويرضى وكما ينبغي لجلال وجه عظيم سلطانه والصلاة والسلام على أسعد الخلق وخاتم الرسل محمد صلى الله عليه ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. This is a third session of this three-session series in which we try to approach Al-Quran with a Maqasid lens, as the title that my sisters put for this course. And I hope that we were able to tackle some of the issues. At first, we talked about the centrality of the Maqasid in the Quranic logic and structure. What is to read through a Maqasid lens, and to ask why, and to look for the higher purposes and objectives and so on. And then we got into some details related to these objectives on the level of methodology. We talked about concepts and values and groups. We talked about commands and so on, and how looking through a Maqasid lens is not against looking for the commands, but it's actually integrating the commands with their objectives and not to go beyond the objectives, but to link the objectives to the concepts. And then from the concepts, we build our definition of groups and categories of people. And we tie that to the different values and so on. I'm aware that I covered a lot of space here and a lot of material that usually is covered through longer time. Like the content of these lectures, I gave in a graduate course. I just gave 3 months ago in South Africa in a graduate course of 30 hours of instruction. So I'm aware that I am compressing a lot of issues here. Hence my decision with my sisters that I get into a general Maqasid framework for Islamic scholarship, which is the third topic, in a general sense, and then try to get Q&A and discussion and comments and so on from you, so that we can discuss the details and critique perhaps some of what I said. Today I will talk about, okay, so now we have the Maqasid and the concepts and the values and so on. How can we build a framework for Islamic scholarship? Does Islamic scholarship need that framework? Do we need a new way to look at Islamic scholarship? I think it's very important that we redefine the concept of mujtahid, the concept of somebody who does reason about the Islamic jurisprudence. That is speaking in English, but in Arabic would be al-ijtihad al-fiqhi. So to reason about fiqh. And fiqh, as we mentioned in the concepts, is an understanding, a wide understanding, a comprehensive understanding of the Sharia. And the Sharia, we agreed, is not just commands of do and do not, but it is also about the bigger picture of the values and the concepts, the bigger picture of the objectives and the categories, and so on, that are tied to the commands. And the commands then are not only the direct commands, but also how the commands are understood, and some of them are implicit. Um, and I believe that the widening of a circle of the reasoner or the faqih or the expert, if you want to call them, or the scholar, to speak in English, I think in a more proper way, would be to widen the circle of Islamic scholarship, to include scholars who are, in addition to those who trained in fiqh and sharia, are trained in a different kind of fiqh for the same sharia. The Prophet ﷺ, in his use of the word ijtihad, is about reasoning. It's about trying to make a judgment. And why do we make a judgment only for issues that we call fiqhi issues, and we don't make a judgment of other issues that are full of values and require concepts and require objectives and require commands as well? We live in, sometimes as Muslims, we live in two silos. The silo of Islam, deen, where I pray and I give zakah and I do hajj and so on, according to a particular understanding. And then if I go out and study or practice economics or management or politics or arts or psychology or whatever it is that I do in life, I do that with nothing to do really with Islam, except for sometimes questions of ethical nature, that sometimes I go back to Islam and ask questions of ethical nature. But so many questions are of ethical nature, even though at a deeper level, there is no design without values that are embedded in that design. Technology is not value free. And we have something in fiqh that we call ulum al-ala sometimes, the sciences of the machines, or the sciences of tools. And we deal sometimes with tools as if there is no fiqh for them. So medicine is a tool, and economics is a tool, and so forth. But no, the very definition of medicine and how you approach medicine, and who is a human being, and is medicine a right for somebody who needs that medicine, or is it something that the rich could afford and the poor could die if they don't have? That is an Islamic definition of a medicine. And when you practice the field of prescribing medicine, that field itself, how do you define it, and how do you define the human being? When you have an operation on that human being, how do you define life, and so forth? There are so many questions. When you do economics, yes, we are not going to have interest, which is actually a very big deal in any economy. We don't even have an answer from an Islamic point of view on how to create an economy without interest. But other than the interest issue, there are so many issues in economics that have a lot to do with the Islamic instructions and the Islamic concepts and so on. But we don't approach economics this way. We just, a brother or sister, they go and study economics, and then they go on and do their professional life with nothing to do with Islam. It's very important that we expand the Islamic scholarship so that Muslims could contribute good ideas and good systems to the world. This is not just for Muslims, but it's for us to participate again in civilization, basically, and not to marginalize ourselves only to the spiritual side of civilization, or sometimes the moral side and ethical side of civilization, and not civilization as a whole. How to approach many issues. And therefore, here, if we would like to do that, we need to expand the circles of Islamic scholarship to include a number of other ways of doing Islamic scholarship. There is the fundamental scholarship, or the usul, or something similar to what I presented to you, where people do ijtihad in the fundamental theory of Islam and how to read the Quran and Sunnah and so forth. But there is the reflective scholarship, which is to reflect upon the revelation in order to read it in a new way and learn lessons from it and so forth. Now, we also should have disciplinary scholarship. That should be part of the Islamic scholarship. We should revisit disciplines from an Islamic point of view. It is not right from an Islamic point of view to just simply say that all of this disciplinary knowledge in all of the academic disciplines that we developed in our today's basically Western civilization, all of this is not un-Islamic. And let's go back to the time when Islam defined disciplines as alchemy and astrology and the disciplines of the past. We really cannot do that. We cannot, in order to practice Islam for every aspect of life, we cannot jump 5 or 6 or 10 centuries back and do science as people did science 1,000 years ago. But we also cannot do science as people do science today. And I mean by science, every kind of science, every kind of discipline, if you wish, academically, and then translated into action and organization and so forth. Why? Because many of these disciplines are not based primarily on Islam. And as people who have a particular worldview, a particular way of defining the human and the society and the family and wealth and so forth, a particular way of defining these things, we need to contribute in a different way. The suggestion here is to take disciplinary studies as a stage towards multidisciplinary studies in order to bridge different disciplines, including what we have traditionally as an Islamic discipline. But then to go beyond that and base our scholarship on studying phenomena, because disciplinary studies as it is today is defined based on the economic system we live through, we live under, and not really based on creating knowledge. In the sense of the creating of knowledge is going to be in a very particular discipline and for an economic reason. In Islam, the objective of knowledge is part of the Islamic well-being in its own right. We produce knowledge in Islam not necessarily for economic benefits. It is for us to live a better life, even if this is not the way the economy runs. In Islam, economy is not at the heart of the is not at the heart of the system of life. Really, what's at the heart is Allah Subhanahu wa Taala and His Messenger and His Deen, and the ultimate goal is success in this life and the next. And that is quite a different approach if you think about it. If we're talking about the economic activity, let's say, at some point at the height of the Islamic civilization, just to give this as an example, the awqaf, or the endowments, were the majority of the economic activity. About half of the land that they had at some point in the Islamic civilization in places like today's Egypt and today's Turkey and today's Iraq and in the East and so forth, half of the land is actually charity land, was charity land that is dedicated to spend on a whole system of hospitals, a whole system of universities and colleges and so forth. It was a society that is structured in a different way. It doesn't mean that we have to necessarily structure it the same way, but at least to learn from that concept of awqaf, or endowment, that not everything in the economic activity has to be owned by somebody, so that they grow and go up and then grow very big, and they can't, and they can't stop growing big, and so forth. That is a different system from a system that makes sure that the necessary and backbone interest of the society is actually owned by nobody. It's actually a charity, is a foundation, what we call today in our legal systems foundations or endowments or non-profits that nobody owns really, and it doesn't mean to go communist, because we think with the binary of communist versus capitalist and so forth, but it's not necessarily that system. What is exactly the landmarks of that system? How do we build a new economic system or suggest something through Islam? I don't know. I'm just working in the methodology. But then somebody who works in the economic field might be able to take some of these ideas and build a genuine system. The applied scholarship here is also very important, how to translate some of these ideas into institutions and organizations, and how these organizations could run towards strategies and so forth. In addition to what we could call a fatwa scholarship, where there are some ethical issues and so forth that we need to discuss. But again, as a member of some of these fatwa councils, it's very important that we revolutionize that, because we are getting to the end of the capacity of people who give fatwa to give guided fatwa, because they really don't understand the reality. Yeah, the other day, we were discussing in one of the fatwa councils genetic engineering and stem cell research and so forth. And all of us don't have the background to even understand the topic that we're trying to give fatwa in. And no, it's not enough to bring somebody for half an hour or 45 minutes to give us an intro on how stem cell research works, or how the economic system in these new and complicated companies work, or to give us an intro to political science and institutions in the modern state. And we are not qualified to understand that. So therefore, there is a gap here. I can give fatwas in the simpler issues of ibadat and sha'air and rights, if you wish, and rituals and so on. I can perhaps get into the rights and ritual side of the family law or other social issues, but I really cannot do justice to the sciences that develop, let alone going beyond these sciences, as I'm calling here, and give fatwas related to counseling or economic issues or strategic military issues or any of these things that people ask about sometimes. Is it halal or haram? I am in this lab and they're asking me to do this kind of thing. And I don't even understand the question, let alone to give an answer. So therefore, it's important that we have scholars kind of merging into a multidisciplinary scholar that we would like to create in order for Islamic scholarship to be more relevant to today. And it's not possible to bring scholars of Sharia and scholars of non-Sharia and put them in one room. In my academic career, we tried these experiments for a couple of years in one of the projects I was involved in, and it didn't work because people didn't have a common language or a common methodology. The Sharia scholar is somebody who studied, fiqh Shafi'iyya or the Malikiyya or any of that, and perhaps did some philosophy and ilm al-kalam and the Mu'tazila and the Murji'a and the Ash'a'ira or something, and that's how they understand the world. And then the economist that we bring in the room, or the counselor or whatever, had studied in England or America somewhere in one of your universities, and comes from a very different planet and a very different philosophy, a different definition of the human and even the purposes of this knowledge that they are talking about and so on. And therefore, they don't have a common language. They live in different centuries. They don't have a common methodology. So basically, the point here is to try to present this framework that I presented to you as an alternative, anyway, not the only research out there in the Islamic thought, but try to present a methodology from the Islamic thought that could integrate these realms, the realm of studying Islam as in history, and the realm of studying the reality, but trying to come from an Islamic point of view, to do these cycles of reflection and to extract the composite framework and to generate theories and principles from the Islamic point of view. And it's not possible to create that multidisciplinary scholar from scratch now. Now, if I'm talking to a group, each of you is a professional who understands a particular field. So therefore, perhaps the good start is for you, each of you with their eyes, with the Maqasid lens that the title of the course is saying, to read the Quran with your Maqasid lens. So as somebody who works as a counselor, let's say, or as a teacher today, or somebody who does investment, or as somebody who is a community leader, or and so forth, or even as in the more, if you wish, natural sciences, you know, somebody who does physics or whatever it is, mathematics. When I read the Quran, how can I read it and reflect upon it in a way that I could add some ideas? Can you do that? Yes, but all you need to do is actually to free yourself from the fiqhi lens. Just don't look now for the rules that has to do with the rights and the family and so on. This is done, and we all live, alhamdulillah, according to these rules. Now look at the Quran as a policy maker, and tell us what kind of policy lessons you can learn from the Quran. And there are many. Look at the Quran as somebody who counsels people or treats them in a particular way, and tell me how much health, from your perspective of health or your side of health, can you see the Quran teaching us? It's not teaching us only about these stories and talking about heaven and hell and that's it, and leaving us with the theology. It's not like that. It's a much more significant and serious book, but we don't read it this way, you see. And it's important that we have this kind of lens of methodology, so that when we read that book, we take the ideas that it's giving us seriously. As an anthropologist, read the Quran and tell us, how do you define humanity? And an anthropologist might tell me, and it happened in one of my lectures, it has nothing to do with anthropology. I told him it does. You guys say, for example, that humanity developed its faith, its language, and its law, and so forth, through millennia. And we had a Stone Age at some point, and then we had a Bronze Age. And you see the world this way. In Islam, if you read the Quran, Allah taught Adam all the names from the beginning. So he had a language, and he was taught actually all the names. Adam had a code of do and do not, a law. And from the time of Adam, which is the first Homo sapien, the first human being, we had a faith, a religion. Religion did not evolve, and Egyptologists tell us that it was the pharaohs who invented the oneness of God and the idea of the hereafter and all of this nonsense. And no, the oneness of God and the idea of the hereafter was way before anything happened in the Egyptian history of the dynasties and so on, in any of the families there, because it started with Adam and Noah. That is pre-flood, even if you want to think in terms of the flood and so on. And we have some, science for that. And therefore, it is not the way we philosophize about some of these sciences. Biologists and people who work in neuroscience and so on, I happen to study some neuroscience in my science background. We haven't thought, as when I studied neuroscience, we couldn't define consciousness. We didn't think that anything is conscious but human beings. And we are conscious as human beings in our brain because of the neural work and all of that. And the more our brain is working, the more conscious we are. And this is a false definition of consciousness. because the Quran is telling us that everything is conscious. Actually, not just animals and plants and marine life, but every material is conscious, is aware of Allah. They have their own way of doing tasbih and so on. And they have their languages. Even if we put aside the material, which we really don't understand and don't know and cannot observe as much, and look at the animals and plants, they are conscious according to the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they are communities like us, and therefore they have languages, and they have families, and they have laws and ethics and so forth. We are starting to discover that in the past, perhaps, couple decades or three, as we do biology in a more advanced way, and we're starting to say, oh well, they seem to have languages, and these languages, they are not as simple as we thought. They are actually advanced languages. We're starting to discover that. But people who worked in marine life or in studied animal life and so on, just a few decades ago, didn't think that. They thought that these are just unconscious, reactionary creatures. In Islam or in the Quranic view, we get a very different outlook at life around us, that it is intelligent and it has its rules and it's respected life. It's just that they speak a different language. The Prophet ﷺ, when they told him about the camel, he said he doesn't speak Arabic. He's Ajami, Ajam, but he has his language, and as a prophet, he was inspired to understand that language. Can we discover these languages? Of course, but that's a different approach, and that's a very respectable approach to deal with animals and plants, for that matter, versus the approach of exploitation and using them as commodity and developing them in the lab and this kind of thing. That is a different approach from the approach that we could take if we have the ability to reflect on the book, and the ability to perhaps re-ask some of the basic questions of the sciences that we studied, and try to re-answer these basic questions. And obviously, I would say it would be easier for what we call generally social sciences to do this reflection, because in social sciences, usually things are not based on mathematical facts and so on. They're based on observation and theories. And yes, Islam could offer alternative theories to society and so on. This web of meaning that we develop and approach the world through could perhaps be at the core of that methodology, a methodology that asks questions and then goes to this web of meaning, trying to build a framework, and then from the framework generate theories and principles, and perhaps go back and re-ask the questions in a way that will allow us to revise some of the premises of the branches of knowledge that we have today, without living in a schizophrenia of being Muslim and putting on my hat and praying in the masjid in a particular way, or going to my lab and being just secular and following a philosophy that has nothing to do with Islam, and sometimes even goes against Islam with its objectives, with its concepts, with the values that are embedded in the design of some of these products that I'm dealing with, that goes against the universal laws of balance, of rectifying earth, of preserving the life around us and respecting it, and so on, and sometimes goes against even the commands that we have. I would jump to here the phenomena-based studies, and I would say, sorry, allow me just to put my plug in. I would say that we are starting to develop a web of disciplines, because we're moving from disciplinary studies to multidisciplinary studies. That's my observation when I taught in the academia of the West, especially in the areas of science and so on. we are moving towards multidisciplinarity. But what we need to do is to move towards a phenomena-based specialization. I believe that the phenomena-based specialization would be more appropriate to apply this framework because the the disciplinary studies are set in their ways and are based on employment and so forth. But if you want to take knowledge and produce knowledge beyond the issues of employment and think about doing and offering new thoughts to humanity, I believe that we should move to a phenomena-based approach where we make people specialize in studies that are multidisciplinary by nature and taking an Islamic approach to that. In the college that I work in South Africa, where I developed with my colleagues there a graduate studies in Maqasid studies, what we do is we divide the research agenda, and now we're moving towards a university status. We're dividing the departments there according to phenomena. So poverty studies, we're creating a department that we call tyranny studies, to study tyranny around the world, not just in the Muslim world, and see how we can deal with it. Poverty studies, though, is not an economic study because poverty has so many sides that could get you so much knowledge of studying that phenomena. To study artistic expressions, these are not just studying art in the traditionalist way, but to study artistic expression in a way that takes all of the sides of the artistic expression and so forth. So basically, to go beyond the disciplinary studies into multidisciplinary studies, and hopefully go beyond that to creating new sciences, at least in the academic sense, until we are able to translate that hopefully into institutions and organizations that could add something new. The Islamic studies so far are the tafsir and hadith and fiqh and so forth, and tarbiyah and Arabic language. And they are in a silo that's different from the rest of life and how it is done. And there is a crisis there, and sometimes we need to deal with the renewal of disciplinary studies by taking this multidisciplinary approach, and then an approach that focuses, as I'm saying, on phenomena to free itself from that. Why do we need to do that? Because I believe as humanity in general, I think we are moving in the wrong direction in terms of how the economy is actually controlling everything we do. And we feel that, I'm speaking to you from Canada, you're in America, we feel that more in this side of the world, where everything is measured in economic measure. But human civilization is not necessarily an economic civilization. This is not the core of the success of humans on earth that we have from the Islamic perspective. And it doesn't mean to be poor or any of that, but it means that you have a different way of labeling value or giving value to things, and labeling happiness and giving levels of happiness to and success, al-falah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about in the first ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. That falah is not necessarily an economic falah. People could live a simple life, but they have much more meaning in their life, and they worship Allah in a deeper way. So I hope that these ideas are allowing you to perhaps comment on everything that you heard in the past 2 lectures and this. As I mentioned, this is a long story and a course and so on, but I thought that I should share some ideas at a higher level of research with you. So perhaps we can have a discussion on that, and hopefully this will enable some of you to come up with ideas that are, inshallah, for the best of Islam individually and collectively. and for the best of humanity. جزاكم الله خير. بارك الله فيكم.
Yeah, I have a question, Dr. Gassed. This is Osama.
ما شاء الله.
How are you?
كيفك أخي أسامة؟
كيف الحال؟
My good old friend. الله يكرمك.
يعني طبعا هو يعني مشكلة the problem of studying in Islam or you know going into the Islamic arena. It has a big taboo that you cannot go in there unless you are very well, you know, coming from the, you know, traditional Islamic education, you know, like Azhari or Ilm Shar'i or, you know, this kind of thing. Um, it is taboo from of course the people who come from that education specifically. Even though that you have mentioned that there is a serious, you know, deficiencies or gaps that are not addressed by the traditional, you know, disciplines and stuff like that. So, so for us to attack these areas that need specialist or you know discipline specific knowledge. And of course, I'm not saying that these specialists should be devoid of يعني basic Islamic knowledge and ikhlas and tajarrud and all of these, you know, prerequisite knowledge. So we as professionals or coming from that you know angle are shying away from going into these areas because we're afraid that first of all we can make a mistake, which can be, you know, from a Shari point of view, produce a fitna of some kind, or and make more damage than it will provide solutions. For encouraging people to go into that area and but in the same time being equipped, that is a lot of us have, you know, deep, you know, desire into advancing, you know, in the different areas. So that's a problem, and the second part of it is, if we put it as a fard ain, or I don't know, fard ain or fard kifaya, for every because we can just let the status quo remain, okay, and we're just gonna remain behind in civilization and in even helping the civilization move forward. We're gonna become behind. We're just waiting for them to come up with something, and we know it's not the right way, and we know we have a better reference system, but we you know, we shy away from that because so should we put it as a fard ain or fard kifaya, so people will struggle with these and, you know, really try to be more forthcoming, and because they feel a personal responsibility that they should really attack this, instead of just, you know, it's fard kifaya and Dr. Gasser is doing it, and others, few others are doing it, so I should not really put my foot forward. So these are just the two things I'd like to you know, get your opinion on.
جزاك الله خير. جزاك الله خير. الله يكرمك. الله يكرمك أسامة. ربنا يبارك فيك. أخي يعني your father is one of my ustads. His specialization is in engineering, but he went into the field of Islam and proposed some very important ideas on entrepreneurship and industry from an Islamic point of view, and technology transfer and so on. And we learned a lot from him, Allah ydi sahha wa yukrimu, based on the fact that he went into the field of Islam with an engineering background. We should differentiate here between Islamic studies and historical Islamic studies. You know, people who tell you you don't have a traditional background, they mean that you didn't study the history of Islam. But there is a difference between Islam and the history of Islam. So there is a difference between studying the revelation with its concepts and objectives and so on, and being well versed in Islam as Islam, versus studying the history of Islam as in fiqh when I studied fiqh eventually and so forth, proper fiqh, what did I study? I studied the history of fiqh. So I went and I studied fiqh shafi'iyya and then the usul and then tafsir. When I studied tafsir, I didn't study the Quran. I studied the history of the understanding of the Quran. And when I studied hadith, I didn't study the exact sunnah. I studied the history of the individuals who narrated hadith and ilm al-rijal and so forth. So Islamic studies are by and large studies of history. And we need to go, yes, history is very important, don't get me wrong. In order to do fiqh, you have to study the history of fiqh. But this is a different kind of fiqh. You have to study then the history of science in Islam, the history of medicine in Islam, and that's a different story. That's not something we study in the College of Sharia. So I think step number one is to define Islamic studies properly and to differentiate between the traditional Islamic studies where you study really books of history versus studying Islam proper, which is the Quran and Sunnah and ulum al-wahi, the sciences of the revelation, not the sciences of the interpretation of the revelation. These are two different sciences. And if you study the sciences of the revelation with your background of whatever it is, design or counseling, as I'm saying, or anthropology or any of that, you will contribute something that people who did not do that would not be able to. Because when, again, back to the example of your father, Allah yasib al-khair, because he is an engineer and he's looking at the world with that lens, he was able to come up with ideas that sheikhs don't even understand the vocab. They don't even know what he's talking about when he's talking about technology transfer and so on, because they haven't studied these kinds of issues. But because he studied them from a secular perspective and now merged that with an Islamic studies of the Quran and Sunnah, he didn't go and study Shafi'i or Malik or any of these people because he didn't need so. He studied the Quran and Sunnah proper. And therefore, he came from the perspective that because the Prophet did that, he read the Prophet in a technology way, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and versus reading the Prophet only through the lens of family law and all of that. You read innovation in his Sunnah or Sirah, or you read planning and management, or strategizing, or something that, because of my background, I'm able to read the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Quran, of course, before that, with a different eye, and I'm able to see different things, interpret, therefore, what I read in a way that could be useful for my profession. So your suggestion, so that we don't shy away as people who are professional, who did not get into the tradition. I happen to be crazy enough to go and do another PhD in the tradition and fiqh and all of that. But we don't have to do that in order to be able to contribute something in knowledge. So the idea of fard kifaya, yes, it is fard kifaya, because so far we really don't have an Islamic approach to economics, really not that much. We have a tamwil Islami, or what we call Islamic finance, but Islamic finance is not Islamic economics. It is an Islamic finance within a capitalist economics. And I was just a couple hours ago discussing with one of our researchers about that. He is trained in economics proper in America and so on. And he was saying, no, we don't have a theory for Islamic economics, as in defining property and wealth, as in rethinking the bank institution. We're doing the good old bank and the good old everything, but we're trying to, halalize it or do a hila, in order for that to call it murabaha instead of mortgage and so forth. But it's the same thing. So Tamwil al-Islami, or the Islamic finance, was not able to offer so far an Islamic economics that is a macro system that is proper. And the Islamic arts, the Islamic nasheed, if you wish, so far, is not able to offer arts. This is just nasheed. We took a small part of arts and we do this nasheed, but we cannot produce a proper movie so far that really takes the attention of the masses and therefore changes the world. And we put our artistic expression in an entertainment form and are able to do that. We cannot design a game so far that our kids could play because the people who are professional in games, they work for Disney and so forth. And people who are into games and so on, are very, primitive, and they still do, paper and whatever, because they're not professionals. We haven't built an Islamic hospital so far that is based on the Islamic premises. I visited the Islamic hospital of Kuala Lumpur, and I told them before I give my lecture on Maqasid Sharia, how do you define Islamic hospital? They told me that every patient who comes in, they give him a Zamzam bottle and a sibha, and if they die, somebody will read Quran. I said, but do you approach medicine like Islamically? They said, how? We're all trained in the UK and so forth. We don't approach medicine. What do you mean by approaching medicine Islamically? And we got into, they said, no, we refuse to give them any medicine that has any pork ingredients. I said, that's all the smaller issue, but the hospital itself, like, how do you define medicine in your hospital? And so forth. And I didn't see any difference between it and the other hospitals, except for giving Zamzam water and all of that. So to go beyond that and to create a real institution, that is a challenge. But inshallah, people like you, Akhi, and other professionals are more capable to do that than other scholars who are trained in history. Long answer, sorry.
جزاك الله خيرا. The dilemma here is how to unlock the potential of millions of Muslims professionals to really put their effort and part of their time and zakat of their waqt and time in this. That I think that is the
hence we created this Maqasid research network that I presented some of the outline for, and we're trying to inshallah launch it hopefully sometime this year, trying to invite professionals to join a research network where we develop research, we develop ideas, and then we transform them into institutions. But as you can expect, it's something that is going to bring us a lot of enemies. It's already bringing, just to speak like that, bringing us a lot of enemies from people who are militant about their disciplines, the Islamic disciplines and the other disciplines. What do you mean to bring Islam to the area of medicine and engineering? Islam has nothing to do with this. And the others say, where is fiqh? Where is my monopoly over fiqh that you are taking? So inshallah, hopefully we do something that contributes, as you mentioned, Akhi, contribute to civilization. We don't have any Islamic voice except for the theological voice of the priests. Whenever there's something, they bring our imams and they make them do a priesthood. But Islam is beyond that, Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Doctor. If anyone has any questions, feel free, like Brother Osama did, to ask, or you can actually also put it in the chat, and then we can read the question out.
I see hands raised here, but I cannot.
So Brother Najib, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. That's it.
MashaAllah.
Brother Najib Kamil, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahlan bi. Jazakumullah khair. I think this has been a really great series, and one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about this kind of separation between Islam or Islamic studies and whatever we want to call the other thing, life studies, career studies. I think that shift needs to happen earlier in the life of the Muslims, because we have come to this point where, as we have grown up, especially those of us in the West who have grown up thinking that, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to learn my whatever math, history, and all of that, and then on Sunday I go to Sunday school and learn some Islam, right? So I think that idea is really more, it has to be started at the beginning, where as we are bringing up the younger generation to think about whatever you do is Islamic, right? That is based on Islam. And I think that can help us when we go into universities and graduate studies. You already have that lens that what I'm doing is connected to this deen. And I am learning not only what I'm being taught, but also what of Islam I know, how that can impact the field and the work that I'm doing. So I think that's something just to think about as we look to the future. How can we make this a concept that's much more understood? It's much more mainstream. And it's not just that you go to college and then if you want to take a few years off, you do some Islamic studies, but there has to be this understanding that they go hand in hand. And that's the Quran and the Sunnah. That's always been the case. I don't know how we got to this place where we think of these things as two separate things. So Jazakumullah khair.
Allah yabarak feek. Well, Jazakallah khair for the thought. Yani. If I may comment on this, yeah, I totally agree with you that we should start this journey earlier in life so that we build that encyclopedic scholar that we used to have in our civilization. Read about Ibn Rushd. He was a doctor and a surgeon, and he wrote some books in medicine, and he was a judge all the way to the high judge, and he was a faqih in the ibadat sense. He has some very good insights about the rites and so on, and rituals and nadhr and all of that. And he was also a philosopher, and he dealt with Aristotle, and he has his own poetry and so forth. And this was the example of a scholar. People who are interested in knowledge did not disciplinize in our Islamic civilization when it used to set the tone anyway. And it's good that we create this earlier in life so that we are not developing until later stages in our life in these two silos, the silo of Islam versus the silo of my profession. It's very important that the younger generation has that. I think a number of key issues. One of them is to learn the Arabic language for our younger generation so that they can approach the original sources with confidence. That is one side. And the other side is to go beyond the Sunday school system into an educational system. We have Islamic schools in Canada here. We have many of them. Of course, we teach the Canadian curriculum, and we teach some Islamic subjects. But perhaps we should include in that, and I'm advising my brothers and sisters here in Canada, for example, on some of this, to include an Islamic approach to life. So yes, we're going to study science and mathematics and history and stuff as we study them, but perhaps let us add some material so that we look at history through how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moves history. And we look at science through how we should develop science from an Islamic point of view, and so forth. Perhaps Islamic schools could be one way of trying to bridge that gap, in addition to qualifying our students, of course. How we got to this place? Well, through basically through a low point in our Islamic civilization, where we were very high, in my view, in terms of civility, but very low on politics and military protection and all of that, which is towards the end of the Abbasids. The fall of Baghdad. Baghdad fell at the height of its civilization, but at the lowest point in its polity and military and so on was very low, and the division between the factions and so on was terrible. But at the same time, Baghdad had enough books. So when the Mughals conquered Baghdad, they threw the books in the river, the Dijla, and they crossed the river with their horses because the books filled the river in Baghdad. And the river in Baghdad is huge for those who saw it. So the river became black with the ink of the millions of books that they destroyed in the river for a number of days. And then it became red, unfortunately, with the blood of the people that they killed in Baghdad. That was the time when we started to get into, as Muslim majorities, into an era of colonization. And colonization brought a different paradigm, which eventually in our Islamic world developed into a Sharia court and a civil court, and a Sharia school and a civil school, and a Sharia university and civil university. We didn't have this division. And if you have an Islamic university, you studied science and mathematics and everything with the studying of the Quran and Sunnah. But we started to go secular with the secularization of Europe, which perhaps was very good for Europe. You know, as Western people, we could see how secularism is good for our societies. But it was not good for people who come from an Islamic point of view, because we don't have this separation between church and state in Islam, or better say it, between religion and life. We actually have a separation between church and state, because imams are not supposed to lead the state or any of that. But we don't have a separation between religion and life in that sense. So we inherited that, and therefore that's the norm now. When you speak to people like that, they tell you, you are bringing an innovation in Islam. And they think that Islam is what they see in the mosque only, not what they can practice in the lab. So perhaps then we could have some initiatives, perhaps in our schools, and we could have multidisciplinary people, as I mentioned to Akhi Usama. His father is one of the examples of that. His books that he wrote on the Islamic perspective to technology and so forth are very interesting. And because he's a scholar of technology in his own right, he was able to break some grounds in that. Wallahu alam. Well, Jazakallah khair, Akhi. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Doctor. I see a question here. I'm going to read this question on behalf of the person that's asking.
What you receive as well, inshallah. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, in the first lecture, Dr. Jasir, apparently you had made a statement. The fact that the economy today is collapsing because of a few days of shutdown is an indication that something is wrong. They're asking if you can explain more and expand on that.
Well, okay. From the Islamic point of view, I'm not an economist, but I have a general framework of the Islamic values that I can speak through. And of course, people who are into economics could add to this and materialize what I'm saying in a more serious way. From the Islamic perspective, there are basic rights for every human being. One of these rights is food, and another right is medication, necessary medication, like, you know, not the frivolous things, the basic medication, and the right for a shelter. People have to have a ceiling over top of their heads. These are rights that every society in Islam is responsible for providing its people. Do we have rich and poor in Islam? Yes, we do, but not poor to the extent of going hungry. Hunger is not allowed in the Islamic understanding of a society. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah curse a people who, a people of a district, who keep one of them hungry, and then he or she goes to bed hungry until the morning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bari'at minhum dhimmatullah. Allah disowns them. Allah disowns a district where people go hungry. This is not supposed to happen. And when you read in his Sunnah sallallahu alaihi wasallam about medication and so on, you conclude that it was a right. It was something that even if that companion does not have the medicine that he needs, the Prophet ﷺ would ask the community to gather whatever it is that the companion would need in order for them to have that medicine. So medicine in the Islamic perspective, and that is now an economic question, is not something that the rich can afford and the poor is going to die if they don't afford. This is not Islamic. That's not how the Islamic system works. The Islamic system says that medication is a right. How did they do it in the Islamic civilization? Is through the endowments and foundations and all of that. Hospitals were charity, all hospitals. In all of these cities we talked about over the centuries of Baghdad and Andalusia and Africa of the time, all the way to, you know, the middle parts of Africa and the Malays and all of that. They have a place where somebody who's sick goes and gets medicated, gets help because it is a right. And because of the awqaf, they didn't have hunger at that time. And when they had hunger, it was because of the corruption of some of the princes. And there were many corrupt princes. But in the average time, there were awqaf, again, to feed people. We still have some remnants of this in parts of the Islamic Muslim majority countries where, people who sell bread, they have, the bread, and they have a basket where they put the extra bread for those who are hungry to come and get the bread. Why? Because they're not supposed to have hungry people in a society that embraces these values. So what is wrong with the system that we live in now? We could have a capitalist system. There's no, in Islam, we don't have, a fundamental problem with any human-made system, a capitalist or a communist or whatever it is, but it cannot cross certain lines. And I think our current capitalism crossed these lines, and the crisis of COVID-19 is showing that drawback in our system, that people literally go hungry, and people are driven out of their homes when they don't have a few $100s, while the system is full of trillions of these dollars. Anyway, they're made out on screens, not even in paper anymore. And that is a flaw in the system, because every human being has a right for, as we call it in fiqh, that's part of a fiqh that we could borrow, because it's derived right from the Quran and Sunnah. Al-Huquq al-Asasiyya, the basic rights, or Huquq al-Adamiyyin, the right of a person being a son or daughter of Adam. That is, the expression that the fuqaha used. And I think that is very important. Somebody has to give that person a shelter over their head. It doesn't have to be a nice home, but it's a shelter. People are not supposed to go homeless or go, medicineless or go hungry in Islam. In fact, as well, to add to this, people are supposed to afford to get married if they need to get married, if this needs expenses, and these kinds of basic rights, that an economic system that doesn't have these limits becomes problematic. In America, we call it social justice, or in this part of the world, in Canada, we call it social justice. So this has an intersection with the Islamic system. It's not necessarily equal to it, but it has an intersection with the Islamic system, and it curbs the system a little bit from killing people, in the name of intellectual property, or in the name of whatever it is that people invent. They end up killing people because they can't afford $2 or $3 for a medicine, because some companies want to make, instead of 1 billion profit, they want to make 20 billion in profit. No, that's not Islamic. So these kinds of things that I would say are wrong in the economic system. Wallahu
a'lam. Thank you, Doctor. Do we have any other questions so far from the audience? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you have one.
Few days of shutdown. Oh, okay, yeah, that's the same question from
Yes.
Yeah, a few days of shutdown are not supposed to harm humanity that much. There is something wrong in the system. It's too monopolist, or oligopolist, if you wish. Oligopolist.
Question: how can we participate in this? If you want to get started on participating in some of the activities.
Well, you're more than welcome. Go to maqasid.org. There we are now collecting names. We have so far about 160 people. Maqasid.org, you click on how to participate or something on the webpage, and then there is a form that you can fill with your specialization and so on, in order to bring all of these people in when we create the network. But we're building the software that would be at the core of this network so far. So far, we have about 160 people. About 40 of them, if I remember, are PhDs, are people who are researchers already, and the others have a master's or a bachelor's, who are willing to be part of the Maqasid Research Network. And then we create units that discuss certain issues and produce research, inshallah. So, ahlan wa sahlan. We're more than happy to collaborate. So.
Jazakallah khair, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Bhavna. I was wondering if I could
Oh,
ask
mashallah. How
a
are you,
quick
sister?
question. Good,
Alaikum
alhamdulillah. How are
salam.
you?
Oh, alhamdulillah.
I had an interesting question. So as you were talking about this new approach, which sounds very exciting, approaching disciplines from an Islamic viewpoint. As you were talking, I was reminded of, and you've already mentioned it, sort of the height of Islamic civilization in Baghdad when all these scholars are coming together. It seems like this is what they were doing. When Najib and I, we spent a few years in Egypt studying Islam, and we were studying all these subjects. And they were, I remember specifically, we studied Islamic institutions was one of our classes. And it was talking about Islamic mental health institutions and how they were using music therapy and color therapy, really exciting stuff that now people say haram and, you know, whatever, or they would say, what does Islam have to do with any of this stuff? So I'm curious, as you're saying, sometimes when people study Islam, they study Islamic history. And we studied about these institutions, but I'm wondering if, as part of your work, you've gone back to what those scholars were doing and actually sort of extracted some of the principles that they were using in establishing those institutions. Because it seems that that approach is sort of lost now, but it was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you read in Islamic history, Jazakallah khair, sister. In Islamic history, there are two kinds of books. There are the mainstream Islamic history books, where you really learn about the politics of the Islamic world only, and fights, and then this became the prince, and then this family took over, and then they divided over that. So we have a problem with the mainstream Islamic history, as in Ibn Kathir and Tabari and Ibn Khaldun, except for the first volume, and so forth. They divide the centuries according to these guys who ruled. Most of them were bloody tyrants, have nothing to do with Islam, but they ruled the empire in a particular way. But then Islam as a civilization is different. That would be read in a different kind of Islamic history books. That one of them is called Al-Khutat, or the development of cities. And one of them, the brand of Al-Niqabat, you know, the professions, Al-Mihan. When you read about the professions, you start to see these things. You start to see how Al-Awqaf developed institutions. And we can learn some marvelous lessons from this. But they are not the mainstream Islamic history that only talks about the military history, really, of Islam and all of the issues. So that's number one in terms of Islamic history. Another point regarding music and therapy and colors and all of that and drawing, this was an integral part of Islamic civilization. The problem is that, you know, the Saudis, when they took over Mecca and Medina, they wanted to impose a particular fiqh on what they called Saudi Arabia, you know, their kingdom, which is the fiqh of Najd, or the desert, really. Allah yarhamu, or Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali used to call it the Bedouin fiqh. But because of the oil and because of, America, they were able to spread that Bedouin fiqh beyond the borders of Arabia to everywhere. And they spoiled the definition of Islam. I was just, Sister Ajara was with me in the other session. I was just speaking in Nigeria, and they were saying, no, but drawing something is haram. And since when is drawing something haram in Islam? We have all of this wealth of drawing. Yes, of course, the Islamic art is not a visual art in the sense of drawing people, because we don't glorify people. We glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the mosque, you will not find pictures of Muhammad salam or any of the Imam. No, we write, and our art is in our calligraphy. But is it haram to draw something? Of course not. We have drawing from all over the Islamic history. Nobody said it was haram. But because of the basically Najdi Hijazi politics, and because of the amount of money that these guys had from the oil, they were able to normalize the Najdi fiqh, which is a kind of fiqh. Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab was an imam who was against the bid'ah and all. Fine. But to normalize that and becomes the fiqh of America and the fiqh of Europe and the fiqh of Africa, that is madness. And that caused Islam to be redefined in a very funny way. where music is haram and drawing is haram, everything is haram except for, you know, the particular mind that they had, and that is a problem that we need to deal with. Now that the Saudis are changing and the new generation is not funding Salafism anymore, hopefully we will have a better understanding of Islam collectively, because they're not funding these kinds of books and these kinds of ideas as they used to in the past. So hopefully this is good news, or, you know, one positive thing that's coming out of this that is viewed in Islam, if you read the sources very well, and then if you look back at that side of history, it's viewed as a right. If you are mentally sick, it is a right that you go somewhere where the society spends on you until you stand on your feet. Some people, because of the, let's say, the capitalist culture that we grow up in, all of us, we think that this is strange. But this is a society in our history that viewed medication as a right. Can we work with that through our capitalist economy? Yes, we can. I'm speaking to you from Canada. You guys in America know that Canada has a nicer system in terms of, and I felt it. Yeah, I was sick a little bit last year, and I went through the system, you know, hospitals and stuff, and I really appreciated it. It's the first time I stayed in a Canadian hospital, and I appreciate it. I said, well, my brothers and sisters in America must be in a really hard place where if I have to, you know, sell the house in order to, you know, spend some time in the hospital, that is a disaster. But because the society views it as a right, and in Canada we have it as in the constitution actually, that is very Islamic. I heard recently, or I read recently, something about New Zealand, and they're doing very well with their economic system. It's a capitalist system, but now they gave character to rivers and forests and so on. So somebody could sue the government on behalf of the river. You see, they gave legal personalities to these right. Natural entities. That is very Islamic. When I read it, I thought, well, that is Islamic. And in Islam, the river has a legal personality. We're not supposed to exploit the river in the, you know, in the exploitation way of our typical civilization, because they have a right. Animals have a right. The Prophet ﷺ defended a camel, defended you know, a chicken when they scared her, and so forth. And he said, these people, these animals, or these non-Arabic speaking beings, as he said, al-ajim, they have a right. So if we change our system, or we suggest these kinds of changes to our system, that is still capitalist and everything, but at the end, it has a different approach. And hopefully we can then produce a better civilization and not let something like COVID-19, you know, bring down everything like that. Allahu Alam. Yeah. So, Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Doctor. There's another question that has been asked in the by Brother Shamik. And the thought is just to read it out loud, just so everyone can benefit and people don't have the computer. So he says, Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Jasser, for mentioning this type of Islamic historical research. Those works that focus on a civilizational perspective, development of cities, Al-Khaf, and other institutions. Are there any of these types of works that are translated into English, is the question.
The books, I am not sure. I think Al-Khutat was Al-Maqrizi and others. I haven't seen any of these books in English, unfortunately. Islamic studies in the West is busy with, you know, Sufism or traditional Islamic law. That's how they define Islam, or studying of Islamic societies. I don't think that some of this is translated here in the West, because I mean, we translate Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi and so forth. We're very busy with Rumi and so on because of the Sufi side, which is interesting, I guess, to Western scholarship. And we translated some of the Madhahib al-Fiqh, the books of Madhahib al-Fiqh, because that's how they like to define Islam, as a law, Islamic law. There's nothing in Islam called Islamic law, by the way, Qanun al-Islami, but they like that. and they promote Islam in terms of its history of law or legal history. But we haven't translated these books of Khutat or Al-Awqaf or any of that, subhanallah. So that's as far as I know. If somebody has information, perhaps could tell us. Ibn Khaldun is translated, the Muqaddimah. That could be a good start in Islamic history if you want to read a little bit, because Ibn Khaldun of today's Tunisia had developed the theory of Islamic history in a good way. So you might find him introduction of Ibn Khaldun. Otherwise, I'm not aware.
Somebody has shared the Islamic Civilization by Mustafa Sabai. So, Allah Alam.
Mustafa Sabai. Oh yeah, that is translated, yes. And oh yeah, mentioning that, there is the other book that is called The Contribution of Islamic Civilization or something. It's published by IIIT in Virginia, International Institute of Islamic Thought, IIIT, something on the contribution of Islamic civilization, a book. SubhanAllah, I can't recall that. I just had the book with me the other day. So look for it. This is a good book as well. In addition to Mustafa Sabai's book on Islamic civilization. And you will find, especially the Center of Awqaf in Kuwait, there is a research center that is busy with Awqaf, and they publish some good stuff. I heard the lecture the other day by Dr. Mundir Qahf from California, where you are. Dr. Qahf on Awqaf. I'm not sure in English. I heard his lectures in Arabic. We used to work back in Qatar in the Faculty of Islamic Studies. Now he's in Sabah Zaim University in Turkey. So Dr. Qahf, K-A-H-F, some of you might know his children in California, wrote on Awqaf. And
just in that spirit, Doctor, do you have other questions on my end? Are there other institutions in the Western world that may be doing or leaning towards what you're describing here? So, without having
no, not really, because our Islamic organizations are community need driven kind of organizations. It's difficult to strategize when you are in an Islamic organization because you kind of tend to the needs of the community. And so, no, I am not aware of Islamic institutes that research. We had an attempt, of course, with the Islamic Institute of Islamic Thought, International Institute of Islamic Thought, IIIT. They had a project for Islamization of knowledge at some point, and they researched that. But now they don't have this agenda as part of their work anymore. So they left a university in Malaysia that has an interest in that integration of knowledge and so on. But I'm not aware of other research centers that are trying to take a new approach to sciences and disciplines and so forth. Islamic organizations are tied to donors, and donors are not interested in change that much, and they like the status quo. Islamic organizations are tied sometimes to red lines put by governments, and governments also don't like this kind of new thinking and stuff. They like to keep them as theology and priesthood, side of the state. They tend to the middle class, and middle class oftentimes are comfortable in their space, and they don't like to change much in terms of the thought that's prevalent in the community. I hope I'm not too harsh in it, but I'm just saying it as it is. Jazakumullah khair.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. A couple of, like you mentioned, a lot of members here are either, people with PhDs or aspiring PhDs. So it's always nice, to get some insight,
mashallah.
We're trying to further education, inshallah. So there's a question here, Dr. Jasir. You had mentioned an Orientalist, a Japanese Orientalist author. Somebody's asking for the name of that book.
Oh yeah, Isutsu. Allah Akbar. Just because I'm fasting, Allah, but he's a great guy. Isutsu, I think for Koyama, but it's called. Why don't you Google it, Dad? I mean, my kids say all the time. I'm from the old generation before the invention of computer, so I'm sorry. I don't see Toshihoku, of course. Asking Siri is not the first thing I think about. Toshihoku Isutsu, and his book on Islam. So I'm going to take his Wikipedia link and put it in the chat. Oh man, high tech stuff. Okay, here you go. So that's Toshihoku Isutsu. That Japanese scholar is one of the best scholars who wrote about the Islamic concepts. His grasp of the Arabic language is fantastic, really. So his book, especially on the moral world, privately, not privately. Okay, let me put it.
Hasn't come through yet.
Everyone in meeting. Okay, I replied to the last message. Okay.
There we go.
So Isutsu had written on the moral concepts of the Quran, a fantastic book. His grasp of the Arabic language is fantastic. Mentioning Isutsu, Muhammad Asad as well. His grasp of the Arabic language, Muhammad Asad, Leopold Weiss or Weiss, has a fantastic translation of the Quran. And from the commentary, I could see the grasp of the Arabic language is amazing. So these two scholars are some of the good scholars of translating the Islamic concepts of the Quran.
Doctor. There's a hand up, but somebody asked a question earlier, and before we go to Sister Bhavna, they were just clarifying the issue of the drawing. So about, can we can draw human beings, or we can only draw things that are non-living. I think somebody wanted some clarification on that.
No, I mean, it depends on how you read. Yeah, it depends on how we read the Sunnah. That's the problem, that sometimes the Hadith is read in a very incomplete way. If you look at the Hadith and the other Hadith and what the Quran is talking about, statues and all of that, then you can start to form a bigger picture. If you find the fatwa of Sheikh Muhammad Abdu on that, I'm not sure if it's translated in English. It is a comprehensive fatwa on the issue of drawing and statues and all of that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that Sulaiman sallallahu alayhi wa sallam يعملون له ما يشاء محاريب وتماثيل. His soldiers at the time or whatever had made statues for him sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. These statues there is nothing haram in making them. So why did the Prophet ﷺ said al-musawwirun and so on? Musawwirun, those who make statues, because they made them for worship. That was in Mecca, and that has a context. The other hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ was praying in front of a carpet, I understand, on the wall or something on the wall that had pictures and had flags and all of that, and then he was busy with it. So he called Aisha. He told Aisha to bring it down because it takes him away from his prayers. It makes him lose his focus. But Aisha radiallahu anha, on the narrations, I mean, she made pillows out of it. She put part of it on the ground. It's not haram. It's, but it's just she used it in ways that are away from his sight, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he prays, that is, so that he doesn't get lose focus that he sallallahu alayhi wasallam wanted to maintain in his prayers, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And therefore, that's the sunnah here. I mean, it's not. And then the other hadith in which al-musawwirun, it is told to them, then therefore blow the spirit in what you created. That is in the context of creating something to be worshipped, or something that they think would compete with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They make a statue and they say this is even better than Allah's creation, in that kind of context. So Allah will ask them, or the angels will ask them in the hereafter, to blow the spirit in what they created, because they were so proud of it. But creating art in that sense, there is no evidence for it to be haram. And you know, it's something that is very important in artistic expression and so on. Read Al-Ghazali and what he said about music and so on. And he said that, you know, those who don't appreciate music have a problem in their inner nature, in their fitra. Similarly, those who don't appreciate art have an issue. Obviously, I'm not talking about drawing something haram or making a statue of somebody, you know, nude. Or, I'm not talking about that. Obviously, that's haram. Or making a, you know, a cross in the church or a statue of Jesus where people bow and worship. I'm not talking about that because that's haram. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ talked about. But artistic expressions in Islam, in any form of, you know, music or drawing or whatever it is, different kinds of art are not haram. They are part of life and part of expression. And there is no evidence for that. It depends on how you understand the hadith. Unfortunately, some people were very strict or very narrow, let's say, in the understanding of these ahadith. And again, back to the Salafi funding kind of thing, it became norm. It became an issue in the world. And then we started to get into these differentiations between the drums and the flute. Okay, the drum is halal, but the flute is haram. And these kinds of things, but there is no evidence for any of that. Oh yeah, the other hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ said that before the hereafter, وَانْتَشَرَتِ الْمَعَازِفِ, you know, there will be lots of music at that time. It doesn't mean it's haram, because there will be also tall buildings, but tall buildings are not haram in the same hadith. And there will be other stuff that he mentioned as signs of the hereafter. So when something is a sign of the hereafter, like tall buildings or like epidemics or any of these things that he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it doesn't mean that they are haram or halal. This is just a description of the world before it ends, as he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah alam, Allahu alam.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. Sister Bhavna has her hand up. Sister Bhavna, go ahead, please.
Yes. Jazakallah khairan. I have more of a comment that I would also like you to comment upon.
Sure.
I take advantage of this, since everyone attending is a mass member. I feel like what you're talking about with regards to this separation of our like secular world and our Islamic world extends into the way a lot of Muslims are engaged in dawah also. And this has been like something that, in fact, I told Najib I was going to say this, and he said he was going to say this too. So we talk about this a lot in our amongst each other. But I feel like even the way, even mass members who, in my perspective, are some of the most progressive Islamic workers in the country, even then, so much of our dawah is either focused on the Muslim community, or it's like we can only do things through Muslim initiatives, Muslim initiated projects, or it's like, pamphlets, information like that, where as opposed to being like a very organic form of dawah where you're getting involved in your community, and not just for this intention of dawah, but really like with the intention of participating and trying to improve. And if you are a person who approaches everything in life through this Islamic lens, it's going to come out in what you're doing, right? If whether you're participating in some local initiative, if it's like a local Black Lives Matter, or if it's a food bank, or if it's just in community organizations, your kids' sports teams, or schools, or the PTA, or the city council, whatever it is, if you're getting earnestly involved and approaching your entire life with this Islamic perspective, at least in my mind, that's true dawah. And our community seems so hesitant. I mean, I've been hearing for 20 years that you start with the inner circle of practicing Muslims, then you go to Muslims who aren't so practicing, then you go to the outer community. And for 20 years, I've just seen us work in this inner circle. So I'm hoping that this doesn't just reform the way we think about all these other subjects, but inshallah reform the way we think about dawah as well.
Wallahi, Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. I appreciate this thought very much. And I think it has something to do with how we define Islam. Islam, if you read the Quran, now back to the concepts. If you read the Quran, Islam is not the religion of Muhammad ﷺ only. Islam is the religion of every prophet. Islam is the truth of faith since the time of Adam until the time of Muhammad. And therefore, it is part of the Islamic history. We mentioned Islamic history. It's part of the Islamic history to study the Christians who believed in Jesus as a prophet, especially before Muhammad ﷺ. This is Islam. They were not supposed to be called Unitarian Christians or whatever before Muhammad. They were supposed to be called Muslims because this is who they are. إِنَّا كُنَّا مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مُسْلِمِينَ. We were Muslims before him. The ayah is saying to study the people from the children of Israel before Muhammad who were Muslim. And then after Muhammad, some of them believed in him, some of them denied him, some of them believe in him, but they really don't know how to express that, or they are afraid of their communities and so on, Christians or Jews. So if we expand the definition of Islam to the definition of every truth out there, we will see Islam everywhere in the society. I see Islam in the West in many people who don't believe in the divinity of Jesus anymore, which is a rising trend. The church is telling us, and they are looking for the truth somewhere. And when they hear about Muhammad ﷺ or read about him and so forth, or get to know Muslims, they say, well, he sounds like Abraham, sounds like other prophets. That's fine. I mean, they're very open to the idea of believing in Muhammad ﷺ, but they don't want to take Islam as a culture, because we define Islam as a culture and as a race. Like a German guy, I had this discussion with him. He said, but I'm not dark. I cannot be Muslim, this kind of thing. No, but and I'm not Turkish, he said. I said, but Islam is not about Turkey and it's not about Africa. And Islam is, you believe in God? Yeah. Do you read about Muhammad? Do you believe in Jesus as a prophet? He said, yeah, no, I don't believe in his divinity. Okay, so you're really Muslim. You believe in Muhammad as well? You're Muslim. No. But, why? Because he came up with the silliest stuff that he, because we defined Islam within a particular race and a particular culture. And I hate to say this, but that definition is convenient politically. And that is part of our problem here. Because the definition of Islam as a moral system and as an open system and all of that is not healthy for the political life that people want. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. You see them in a positive light because you see Islam like that. But if you see Islam in the way that is a racist Islam that people propagate, you will see them, and you will see them as foreign too. But you see them in a positive light because as a Muslim, you care about social justice. And you think blacks in America have been mistreated for the longest time. And therefore, as they might have mistakes in some areas, but you have a positive outlook to these revolutionary kind of movements. But people who have a different kind of agenda, no, they would like to label every social justice movement from the Arab Spring all the way to Black Lives Matter as a rogue movement. And that is part of a bigger political system that people who are priests are part of. Whether they think that being part of the system helps Islam in some way, or I'm not judging people's intentions here. Many of the scholars I know, let's say back home, to avoid the American talk, back home in the Arab world, many of the scholars who are part of the system are sincere scholars of Islam, and they think that they are trying to do that, but they play the game of priesthood and defining Islam in a very cultural way, not in its dynamic way that could make a change, especially when it comes to the question of social justice and movements that are calling for freedom and calling for some equity back in the Arab world. So I guess part of this too is the immigrant mentality. People sometimes when they immigrate to the West, they would like to, keep for themselves, and they long for, the dishes that they used to eat and but then second generation people like my children or like many of you here or people who lived long enough in the West, they don't have this attachment to the cuisine of their parents and whatever. And hopefully they are able to present Islam in a better way, because they are, my kids here are Canadians like everybody else. They eat the same food. They don't eat pork and drink alcohol, but they don't have likes for the Arabic cuisine that I eat or drink, this kind of thing. So hopefully they are able to be part of the society in a better way, and see the da'wah not to be for Muslims only. Da'wah is originally for non-Muslims, for people who are not aware of Islam. Allahu A'lam.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Doctor. Now we have Sister Asma Khabti. Go ahead. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahlan. Jazakumullah khair for everything. I had, I guess, a couple of questions or kind of reflections. I'm trying to sort it out in my head myself. So there's a couple of, in terms of, I really love this whole concept of, doing kind of like redefining Islam, Islamic thought and Islamic relevance to all the different sciences and fields. And kind of like how you mentioned how, in terms of Islamic thought and civilization, it was at its peak when the Mongols came and destroyed Baghdad, right? And so there are people both from within the Muslim world as well as outside, like Orientalists and others, who kind of blame, let's say, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali for kind of instigating this backwardness, if you will, where, like pretty much no more bid'ahs, just stick to the basics and no innovation. And that philosophy, that religious or theological philosophy, also transcended into the other sciences. And so, the Muslims stopped, progressing in terms of the mathematics and scientific fields and all this other stuff, or at least that's what they claim. So how do you kind of answer that, as well as the counter argument for the Muslim who wants to preserve the deen? Because I can see how when we focus on maqasid and maqasid al-sharia and make that kind of the premise for our fiqhi opinions, if you will, that you start getting sometimes opinions and, fatwa that sound very off, at least from the traditional sense, right? And it almost kind of looks that you're kind of starting to go off into that bid'ah direction. And you could kind of see that could easily develop over time. So how do you kind of foresee kind of having that balance where you're true to the Islamic message from the Quran and the Sunnah and applying it to our modern context, but at the same time, preserving it and not, kind of deviating into bid'ah? So like, how would you kind of almost answer both groups, if you will?
Jazakallah khair. Well, Jazakallah khair, Sister Asma. Barakallah fikum. And your Rab'a sign and your name reminds me of Asma al-Biltaja.
Allah yarhamha.
Subhanallah. طيب, the first question, Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali, no, Al-Ghazali, yes, he attacked philosophy, but Al-Ghazali is a Greek philosopher at the end. When you read his Mustasfa, as they say, I believe that what they say, that he studied the Greek philosophy, it entered his stomach, and it never came out, even though he attacked the philosophy. But what he attacked, really, if you read the Tahafut, or the feeble argument of the philosophers, when he attacked the philosophers, he attacked associating others with Allah. He attacked idolation and idols and all of that. He didn't attack the Greek philosophers for who they are, and therefore he Greekized the Shafi'i usul big time. If you look at the Mustasfa, you will find that he is, syllogizing al-qiyas and so forth, and maslahat, and thinking in a, so no, we can't really put that burden on Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali, there are two Ghazalis actually. There is a Ghazali pre his isolation that went on for 11 years that he talked about in the introduction of his Ihya Ulumuddin. And there is post-Ghazali, post-isolation Ghazali. The pre-isolation Ghazali, he was an Imam of Shafi'iyya, and the Shafi'iyya and the Hanafis fought over this courtship in Damascus and so forth until Damascus was burned and looted. We read in history. And he was a leader of a faction, really, that fought with the other factions and so on. Then when he went to isolation and he came back and he wrote Ihya Ulumuddin, he was a very different creature because he considered al-fiqh to be from ulum al-dunya, to be from the seekers of the dunya, whatever science they follow. And he is saying the real ulum or ulum al-din is what he put in Ihya, or the sciences of the heart, really. So he came back more on the Sufi side and more focusing on a deen in the sense of the heart. That takes me to your second question, how to preserve the deen. It depends on what you mean by deen. If you mean, al-thawabit, or the fixed matters in Islam, yes, the fixed matters in Islam have to be fixed. And how do you define the fixed matters in Islam? Well, ask any Muslim kid. He will tell you what is haram and what is halal in Islam. And ask any scholar who's reasonable about Islam, he will tell you what is fixed in Islam. So what is fixed in Islam is not a complicated question. They are well known. And then there are issues that are matters of different opinions and so on. This is not fixed. Once you get into the different opinions, among scholars who are basing their opinions on evidence, not just anybody who's saying anything, then you realize that you are in the area of variables, in the area of gray in Islam. And that area of gray, yes, will be influenced by this Maqasid thinking in a number of ways, because that is a flexible way of thinking anyway. Yeah, once you get into the area of the financial dealings and the area of society and organization and questions of that sort, not the question of the conditions for a marital contract or the ibadat of the prayers and zakat. These are fixed and they're done 1,000 years ago, and nothing will change there. And if I change anything in what is halal, what is haram, and I make zina halal, for example, then I'm not a scholar, and Islam will continue and zina will continue to be haram. Anyway, so the fixed matters, I don't think we should worry about, because this is a deen. This is Islam, and Allah preserves Islam anyway. And they are clear. The issue of bid'ah as well, you have to also put another question mark. What is bid'ah and what is not? Bid'ah is a bid'ah in the deen, in the sense of changing something that is well known to be part of Islam and make it not part of Islam. That is bid'ah. But bid'ah is not innovation. Innovation is fine. Ibtikar, is fine. Bid'ah is a fabrication, is an addition to something in Islam that is not part of Islam. Making something halal, haram, or something haram, halal, in the black and white sense, not in the grays. The grays are, I studied fiqh and I taught fiqh for some time. The grays are all okay, really. Whatever madhab you take, when you deal with these gray issues, well, some of them are off, but in general, I am not concerned about that. I'm concerned more about taking the Maqasid as an apologetic approach to wrong in the society. And that is unfortunately happening a lot. Like, in the name of Maqasid, people want to legitimize zina, what we call zina in Islam, in the name of human rights or whatever. No, the zina is zina and will continue to be zina. And family is defined in Islam in a particular way and will continue to be that. That is fixed in Islam. We're not going to develop that. I'm concerned people who take the preservation of wealth and they justify the worst kinds of monopoly and this kind of thing in the name of the preservation of wealth and exploitation, that's not preservation of wealth. So I'm concerned about people who take the maqasid as an apologetic tool for wrong practices that go against the fixed matters in Islam. How do you preserve the deen? By promoting these kinds of new ideas, because this is the deen. It is the deen that we bring Islam to the question of social justice and the question of the environment and the questions of artistic expressions and limits on artistic, ethical limits on artistic expressions, and questions of education and counseling. This is the deen. But how do you preserve the deen? Sometimes we define the deen in a very narrow way, and deen is much wider than the ibadat or ta'abudiyat or the rites or rituals. Islam is much wider than that, inshallah. So I hope this answers the question of its sides. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much. We're running to time. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I have perhaps a closing question, a closing thought, Doctor. Alhamdulillah, we've spent 3 weeks now learning all of this important concepts. So I want you to please share with us, what are your ideas for next steps? How do we evolve what we're learning from here? What do we need to do to continue really on this path of looking at the Quran in a very different way? You know, bringing out the Maqasid concepts in the Quran. What can we do as our study goals? Up to the bigger picture of, you know, again, furthering Islamic scholarship like we did today. So to bring us along the next steps for what we need to do in general to be able to further this knowledge and make it applicable to us, inshallah.
Well, it's a journey. It's a journey. Part of it is a journey of study, and part of it is a journey of practice. The part that has to do with study is to read the Quran, yes, for ibadah and so on, for your heart, but also read it with your mind and try to come up with reflections and all of that. That's if you want to do that individually and your time and effort would only allow that. You could also have a journey of study by, you know, joining these research groups and try to do research, especially if you are an academic like many of you, I can see from the list, to try to think about this subject academically and try to contribute in the industry of ideas. Because as academics, we work in that industry of ideas, not industry in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, inshallah, of ideas that are useful. It's a journey of study that you could have if you would like to read the Quran and the Sunnah, obviously, for yourself, to work more on your Arabic language. And if you're, you know, if you want to do that, I always say in my lectures how when I first came to Canada back in the early 90s, I didn't speak English really. I passed the English as a second language, like tests and all of this, memorized some stuff. But a language is practice, you know. And after some time, I started to teach in English and write in English, and so forth. Still not my language, really, not my best, you know, talking and writing. But you could learn that language if you are serious in the journey of study, and try to do it, or at least as parents and so on, try to make sure that our second generation or our next generation are versed in that language, not for any race, but for the sake of Islam, for the sake of Quran and Sunnah. So a journey of study, a journey of practice is to try to also question some of what you do, perhaps as a professional, or if you are in charge of something as a professional, try to think about the ways you do things. Maybe there are better ways of doing things. Or if you are a professional and your ways are very set, perhaps you could also have a parallel project of creating a new kind of company or a new kind of practice or a new kind of doing something according to Islam. Perhaps as a teacher, you are teaching in a public school and you are set in your ways, obviously teaching the curriculum. But perhaps you could contribute to the Islamic school next door in a better way. Try to bring more genuine approaches, you know, new ways of looking at this. So in the journey of practice, as Islamic organizations, and I assume that all of you are part of MAS, how can we how can we develop our movement? We have the same question here with MAC, the Muslim Association of Canada. They used to be the same organization back in the days, and then they divided into those two organizations back in the mid 90s. I'm proud to have been part of that transformation. But anyway, so basically, how can this movement that claims to be a genuine Islamic movement, how can it make a change in the society, as our sister mentioned? Not just a change in the community, not just serving the community, but how can we bring the light of Islam to the society? How can we make a difference, really, as a movement by tackling real issues? We don't have to go as revolutionary as Black Lives Matter, even though it's good to contribute there. But how can, as an organization, how can we make a difference, really, and not just be the minority that is whatever, like how can we really make a change in the society on different levels? And I think that takes strategic thinking, because that framework of concepts and values and so on is a framework of strategy. If you put that on a piece of paper and think about the concepts that have priority in the movement, the values that we manifest, and so on, then we are able, the objectives, then we can redraw our vision and mission in a better way, and we can present ourselves in a more strategic way, hopefully, that serves Islam in the wider sense. So these are just thoughts, inshallah, for there. Love, bless you.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Doctor. So it looks like we don't have any further questions, just thoughts and ideas. And alhamdulillah, we still have the WhatsApp group, and I'm hoping that this is the beginning of our many engagements with you, Doctor, inshallah. We hope that we can have some more lectures and classes and things of that nature with you, inshallah.
More than happy, inshallah, online, or as we have been discussing, a visit to your...
Yes, we try, subhanallah.
And organizing some stuff after all this madness is over. So inshallah. Inshallah. My greetings to everybody, and salamat wa tahiyyat wa jazakumullah khair, da'awat, inshallah.
Please give us a closing dua, Dr. Justin, inshallah.
Allah yakrim, Allah yakrim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, Amin, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulil kareem wa alihi wa sahbihi. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك يا مولانا سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات لا تدع لنا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا عيبا إلا سترته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا مرضا إلا شفيته ولا مبتلا إلا عافيته ولا دينا إلا قضيته ولا حاجة هي لك رضا ولنا فيها صلاح إلا قضيتها يا كريم اللهم إنا نسألك إيمانا صادقا ويقينا دائما وعلما نافعا وقلبا خاشعا ونورا ساطعا ورزقا واسعا وشفاء من كل داء وغنيمة من كل بر ونجاة من كل إثم وتوبة من كل ذنب اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك وبعفوك من عقوبتك ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا صلى الله على محمد جزاكم الله خير بارك الله فيكم.
إن شاء الله.
جزاك الله خير.